Alright, so if the thumbnail didn't give it away, the whole purpose of this video is to build the bed, but also to review these plans from Foureyes Furniture. These plans are $90, which is fairly expensive for woodworking plans, but this is really robust. These plans are extremely well done, not only in the step-by-step instructions, but also in all the different options and appendices they have throughout. So let's take a look at this first video and see what Chris and Sean have to say.
Hey, it's Sean and Chris, and welcome to your online project course.
In the left sidebar menu, you'll see all of the video chapters for this course, and these are the heart of the course.
Below that, you'll see several appendix videos. These cover some of the broader woodworking skills that relate to any woodworking project.
Below those are the info packets, which include dimensional drawings and quick reference information about the build.
So, like I said, pretty robust. I think this is going to turn out really well. Let's get into the video. Now, one of the first steps in the plan is to determine what size bed you're going to build. We're actually making a king size bed, so we need to establish the size of the bed and our baseline length and baseline width based on the size of the mattress. From there, I marked out all the milling requirements and the cut list, and I could go ahead and get to work. I do want to be fully transparent with you guys throughout this process. Truth be told, I have been a fan of the Foureyes woodworking channel since the beginning of my woodworking career, which was about 7 years ago. That being said, I did pay full price for these plans. This was my idea. It wasn't pitched by Chris or Sean. And while they were on board with the idea, there are no strings attached. So this will be fully my opinion to determine whether or not I think these $90 plans are really worth the price tag. And spoiler alert, I think they really are. Now, don't click away just yet. They may be right for me, but keep watching to see if they're right for you and right for the projects that you want to build. Now, shifting gears back to the project at hand. I'm making a king size bed, so the boards I needed were massive. They were just too big for my joiner, so I had to skip plane them through my planer in order to get down to all the thicknesses that we needed for our different components. Once I had those figured out, I could turn my attention over to making templates. Making templates was one of the first new woodworking techniques that I was really excited about trying to add to my workflow. When I build furniture, I typically stick to really generic designs, squares, rectangles, maybe a slight taper, nothing as intricate that would require a template to build. So I was excited to try making templates out of 1/2" MDF and seeing if I could reproduce these shapes as well as I see them on the Foureyes channel. While most of the rough shaping was done at the bandsaw, I did turn over to the spindle sander to refine the shape and get all of those pieces nice and smooth out. Remember, when making templates, anything that you template on the edges, if there's a dip or groove, your bearing's going to follow that dip or groove and it's going to transfer to your final piece. So spend a lot of time here refining the shape and making sure it's exactly what you want it to be. On that note, if you're really intimidated about trying to make a template and you're afraid you won't be able to get it right, you can always buy them directly from Chris and Sean and they'll mail them to you. They're only $30, which if you're already spending $90 on the project, $30 to make sure that you can make the right shapes without fail seems like a small price to pay. However, mine did come out pretty well, so the next step was to grab my stock and transfer the shape of the template onto the stock, and then I can rough cut that out before I start my template writing. I like to use a pretty thick Sharpie when doing this. That way, if I run the bandsaw blade on the outside of that Sharpie line, I know I've got less than 1/8 of an inch to clear up with routing. On a quick note, before we dive into routing, this yellow double-sided tape is the best double-sided tape I have used ever. The yellow stuff peels off really, really easily, and the tape has a really good hold, but still comes off of your workpiece without damaging anything or leaving a real nasty residue. I'll throw a link to it down below if you're interested. Now, when it comes to routing, we're going to use two different routers. I'm going to use my trim router here with a pattern bit, which has the bearing writing on the top of the router, and a flush trim router, which has the bearing writing on the bottom, and we'll hook that up into the router table. The pattern bit is going to match up against your template and cut the same profile on the workpiece itself. Then you can remove the template and use the new profiled edge you've already marked on your piece to reference that bearing on and work it down. Take small bites here. If you take big bites, you have a chance of tear out or something running away from you, which can be pretty dangerous. You can't see it here, but I do have this piece clamped down to the workbench on the opposite side to keep it from going anywhere. Now that the templated edge is established on the workpiece, we can use a flush trim bit at the router table to clean up the rest of that profile. This can always be a bit of an intimidating process. The router is just kind of a scary tool. If it grabs wrong, it can bite and run away from you. So make sure you've got a firm grip here. A better option, which I wish I had had at the time, I just didn't have a longer bit, is to use a longer pattern bit in your trim router and just keep stair-stepping that profile down. That way you have to take less of a bite with your flush trim bit at the router table. Once we had our legs shaped, we could set those aside. For my particular lumber that I was able to get my hands on for this project, I couldn't get boards wide enough to do one board per side, so I did need to rip them down to get some clean edges. That way we could do a glue up and have the width we need on either side. Now in this circumstance, I have a domino, so I'm using my domino for alignment and to make sure that everything is nice and coplanar. However, if you don't have a domino, Chris and Sean actually dive into what they refer to as the domino appendix section of their plans, and they'll show you all the different alternatives that you can use instead of using the domino. Actually, instead of me telling you, why don't I let them?
Okay, in this chapter, I'm going to go over the alternatives to the Festool domino. We get asked a lot if you need a domino to complete our project courses, and we do indeed use the domino a lot, but it by no means is a requirement to complete a project. So I'm hopefully going to illustrate some of the alternative methods depending on a few specific applications.
And following that, Sean goes in to highlight all of the different options and methods you can use if you don't have a domino. That includes dowels, mitered splines, the list goes on. So if you don't have a domino, if you don't want to invest in this pretty expensive tool, then don't fret, these plans will still work for you, and there are several different ways to make it happen. Back to my build, I'm getting each of these panels glued up, getting pressure on both the bottom of the panel and the top of the panel just to prevent any kind of bowing from happening, and cleaning up that glue seam to make sure that I don't have any bleeds or any ugly spots later when I go to sand. Now, the next day, I was ready to cut the joint faces on my template, but I didn't turn my camera on, so let's just pretend that it went something a little bit like this. Perfect. This actually introduces the second woodworking technique that I was really hoping to kind of develop during this process, and that is being able to make repeatable cuts at your table saw were unique pieces just using some scrap pieces of plywood. So I got my iPad out, I set up the video, and I literally just walked through it step by step as Chris was doing it on his end. Now, while they provided specific measurements to do this set of legs, this idea, this method would be super useful in a bunch of different options. Once I had everything nice and secure, I decided to give it a good shake test to make sure that nothing was going anywhere because I'd never used this method before and I didn't want anything to go wrong. So yeah, just a little bit of this and everything's rock solid. We're good to cut these joint faces. And again, the best thing about this method is that it's repeatable. So once I finish one leg, I could take it off, set it aside, and rinse and repeat with the next leg. The stops are still in the same spot, the legs are still the same length and still the same width. So it's gonna cut off the same amount of material in order to match up those joint faces perfectly. This is a super useful skill and definitely something that I'll be incorporating in my process flow going forward. With our leg joint faces all queued up, we could turn our attention back over to our panels and start cutting them to length. I squared up each end, and then I cut both leg rails clamped together at the same time and cut both pieces for the head rail together at the same time. That way to make sure everything was the exact same measurement. Now, if you're looking closely here, you can see that we're about to run into an issue that past Donnie just did not realize. At first I set it up right, and then I flipped it because I was so concerned with getting a good camera angle with the lighting and the direction of the saw that I put the saw on the wrong side of the piece. And as you can see here, I'm about to get a lesson in gravity because the weight of the track and the saw is all on that top board that is falling. That is not what you want to do. Make sure you set it up on the right side of the board. Thankfully, it didn't snap anything. I didn't lose any material. Just be safe and put it on the right side and make sure you make smart cuts. Anywho, now that they were cut to the right length, we could rip them to the final width. I did reference the leg on the fence of the table saw to make sure that the distance was correct. I didn't film it, but I did, and it matched up really, really nicely. Now I was confused and I couldn't quite remember where to attach the dominoes and what profile edges we wanted to route before gluing up. So I whipped out my iPad and I checked the plans, and sure enough, the plans walked me right through it. I was able to mark everything out for my dominoes, or in your case, your dowels or biscuits or floating tenets, whatever option you decide to do. And I could get everything marked and start mortising out those dominoes to get this glue up going. Now with the headboard, because it's such a wide piece, I want to account for wood movement, also courtesy of the plans. So we drilled 2 of those dominoes on the wide setting and the lowest one on the tight setting. That way the board could expand and contract as needed. We got our dry fit figured out. We routed the profiles on our legs, which in this case was a very large, I think 1/2 inch round over. And again, the plans highlight exactly where those profile edges need to go and when you need to do them. That way you don't end up trying to add a profile after something's glued up and there's not enough room for your router bit. With all the profile edges figured out, we could turn our attention to the glue up. And Chris even mentions in the plans to find someone to help you, and I did. But I was so excited about the glue up, I didn't actually consider how many clamps I would need, and you can tell how long this took, just evidenced by the daylight slowly going away in the background. My wife and I spent a good 40 minutes getting the headboard and footboard clamped between the angles and just the overall length of clamp we need in order to get this pulled off, but my goodness, what a chore. Finally, with that beast all glued up, we could turn our attention to the bed hardware, and Chris actually highlights this really well.
In this chapter, we're going to cover a quick little jig that I used to mortise in the bed hardware.
And this marks the 3rd item that I was really excited to add to my bag of tricks, courtesy of these plans. If I had ordered a set of bed hardware that didn't come with instructions, I would have returned them. I would have been too intimidated to try to figure it out with no kind of instruction at all. That's just not an area that I'm really strong in. However, in this case, Chris walks through this really, really smoothly. I found the same hardware on Amazon, so I'll link it down below, but it is very high quality. Our previous bed that I made, I used cheap stuff and it rattles around if you sit on the bed or move in any certain way. And this stuff is rock solid. Now, for this video's purposes, I'm going to skim over this process because I doubt I could explain it as well as Chris does in the plans. So enjoy a little bit of routing and a little bit of hardware fitting. Now, I know some people see the making of this jig and think that's not complicated at all. You literally have 3 boards screwed together. Like if you thought about it for 10 seconds, you could have probably come up with something like that. And maybe you're that way. Maybe you have that critical thinking, creative mindset, but I really don't. I don't have a creative brain. I have a worker's brain. I have a grinder's brain. I'm very good about replicating and I'm very good about continuing something until I get it right. But in terms of coming up with a creative solution, that's just not an area where I shine. So being able to reference material like these plans that walk me through things that I would not normally think of on my own was super beneficial. Again, something else that I'll be able to add to my bag of tricks in order to make my woodworking projects that much more robust moving forward. And now, using a self-centering drill bit, I could go ahead and pre-drill and get the hardware attached. I know I said the residue comes off really easy and there's a little bit of residue still on the sides. That's because it was clamped down because I use the offcuts as an angle to clamp against in order to get even pressure. So typically there is no residue. That was just super clamped on there, so a little did stick around, but it came off with just a little bit of sanding. Once everything was figured out with the bed hardware, we could add our final profile edges and move on to the sanding process. Now, in all actuality, I probably spent 3.5 hours sanding this day, but I'm going to boil it down to this about 10-second clip to save the time. Just know that I started at 150, went to 220, and then did a little bit of hand sanding with a block at the end. And now that the bed frame is technically done, I went ahead and turned my attention over to the slats, which I just used 3/4 inch plywood here. If honestly there was one area where I would critique the plans that Chris and Sean put together, it's how they went about doing the slats for the mattress setup. Now, it's not wrong by any stretch of the imagination. I just think it might be a little over-engineered. He uses a cradle system and utilizes the 8/4 inch material that he also used for the legs. He does, however, go into noting that you don't have to use this 8/4 material. It can just be difficult to buy that size material from lumber yards and get shorter boards. In my case, though, I was able to get shorter boards, so I didn't even have these extra 3 boards that you would need for the setup that he ran with. So ultimately what I did is just glue and screwed a couple of 3/4 inch pieces to the outside rails at the lowest setting. That way I could keep my mattress as low as possible, since this is kind of a low platform bed. And then I added 6 T-shaped support blocks in the middle of the bed. Since we do have a king and it is a very wide mattress, I wanted to make sure there was ample support. And with this setup, we've had the bed in our bedroom for over a week now, and there have been 0 issues in terms of supporting us. And that's me, my wife, both my kids, and our 100-pound dog. So I think the setup is more than sufficient and doesn't quite require the extra engineering of the cradle setup. All right, we're getting down to it here. Moving on to finish. Beds are not like tables. They're not going to get a lot of wear and tear, glasses, plates, things like that. So I didn't think anything strong like Rubio Monaco was really necessary. I just wanted an oil-based finish to really help that walnut pop. So I went with something really simple like boiled linseed oil. It's about $10 at a local big box store, and I can just reapply seasonally as needed to keep it looking really fresh. But again, since beds don't get a lot of wear and tear, I think this is going to be more than sufficient. And of course, at the end of a project, there always needs to be time just to goof around with the kiddo in the shop. However, with the finish applied, we can move the bed up to our bedroom and finally take a look at that B-roll. Hey Sean, this one's for you, bud. Honestly, I am really happy with how this came together. There are definitely things I would have done differently in terms of my own execution and the milling process, but in terms of process flow and the uniqueness of the design, this is definitely something I never would have come up with on my own. So I'm really happy to have a cool piece like this in my own house. So here are my final thoughts. The bed's beautiful. I love it. I love the way it came together. I love the way it looks in the space. One thing I didn't count on was, because it's a king size bed and because it's a platform bed, that means a shorter bed profile and massive pillows. So the unfortunate thing is, with everything made up on the bed, you can't really see the headboard anymore, but small price to pay for such a cool piece. And that's going to do it for this one, guys. Until next time, get out there and start your own project. And if you're curious, definitely go check out these plans.